A Shalom Akim Shalom Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Requai, back in here with another Quake and Lord's will. Just a little bit of exhortation, and hopefully this lesson is truly edifying. For today's topic, I wanted to just discuss the knowing of essentially many books, and how a lot of those books sometimes that we read in regards to sometimes snippets of our history, and sometimes it kind of, when you filter it out and you realize, okay, these books can be very, very edifying. So one of the things that I've noticed, it doesn't translate into being good character, right? Because a lot of the information sometimes we read about, in the moments of our history, whether it might be, for example, within the Dark Ages, or maybe it's within the Josephus, or maybe it's within the Greek, Empire, or, whatever particular time, Jake was in a particular area, and made settlement, because we know, pursuant to the prophecies, that, we were essentially scattered, right? Knowing a lot of these many books, it doesn't always mean that, a person can have good character, right? So, or it doesn't, I should say, translate into good character, because sometimes, if you're the type of person that you focus heavily, in, just doing a lot of research, it doesn't always mean that, okay, the character, my character portion, isn't strong, right? Essentially, when I say character, I'm kind of referring to, the character of Yahushai, and referring to those, essentially those fruits of the Spirit as well, right? Because also those things as well, because we read about these are different accounts, within the scriptures, seeing how in the ways of our forefathers conducted themselves within certain situations, and understand that, they exemplified a certain level of this particular fruit of the Spirit, right? So that's mostly what I'm kind of focusing on here, because sometimes in the making, in the knowing of many books, so to speak, it doesn't always mean that a person might have good character, right? Kind of like how a person can have a lot of money, but it doesn't always translate into them actually being good, right? So as a matter of fact, let me start off with something Yahweh actually said. Then I'll get this first precept here. Since I mentioned good. This is Matthew chapter 19, verse 16, and it says, "And behold, one came unto him and said, Good master, what good thing shall I do, that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him," Yahushua speaking, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is the Most High Yahweh. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. And he saith unto him, Which? Yahushua said, Thou shalt not do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as as thyself." Right now, that's really where proper etiquette actually comes from, right? We're supposed to be, essentially, as a people, we're supposed to be planted as a noble vine, but our people, essentially, as the scriptures say, that we've become a degenerate plant of a strange vine unto the Lord, right? Through these different, odious works, as described in Wisdom of Solomon, right? So, Yahushua had the mentality of, like, don't praise me and don't see me as good, right? It's the Son of the Most High, and he does not, essentially, he's not boasting in himself, right? is giving praise and credit to his heavenly Father, right? So, you know, um, so I kind of just wanted to read this real quick. Since I mentioned, many books and so on and so forth, just as an exhortation, because sometimes we might focus heavily on one portion, and then sometimes we might neglect other aspects of our development. So is this really just to ensure proper development, and actually understanding sometimes a lot of the situations that we're in, also in examining a lot of our own situations, is help to, round out that character portion, exemplify certain aspects of character, right? Because a lot of those different stories, and I always use this example of David and Saul. David having the opportunity, to actually get his own vengeance, but he didn't take it, right? So that's kind of the aspect of character is what I'm referring to here, and these are things that as a people, are very, very actually important for our development, because we don't actually learn proper character. Their character is actually just taken on, from the famous elk, or the famous echelon of our people of this world, right? So this is Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 12 here, and it says, "And the further by these, my son, be admonished of the making of many books. There is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh," right? So there is no end to a lot of these different what's it called, these different books, right? And we're in a time where essentially knowledge has increased. You have all this AI technology, you got all these AI tools, right? And but at the same time, the scriptures talk about us seek ye the book of the Lord and read, right? Because sometimes, even for your own development, you can read a precept in one month, and then a couple months after, with coupled with experience, and there is more depth and understanding into regards to that same precept, right? So it's essentially the scriptures is living waters as you actually experience a lot of things, for yourself, and it hits a lot differently. It's not like the precept has actually the words, or the words have changed themselves, but you realize, through experience, you've gotten more insight, you've got more understanding from that same thing that this person, whoever was speaking, actually had said, right? So and that's one of the things you can't really extrapolate from these other books. And I'm not knocking the what's the word I'm looking for, the studiousness, in terms of like, okay, you go to certain aspects of different books to actually what's the word, you go there to learn more about particular aspects of our own history, or it could be something, sometimes it can be factual, right? But it doesn't mean that it's going to translate into like good character, right? So when I say character, I'm referring to like understanding and examining a lot of the ways of our forefathers, right? Examining the ways of Yahushua and the examples that he left, right? You know what I'm saying? Because there were just always examples our forefathers went through that in situations we can apply to ourselves as well, right? So let me go to something that Paul said. Just bear with me one second. This is 1 Corinthians 13, and I'll start at verse 1 and just read down a little bit. Here it says, "Though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I can remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profit me nothing, right? So, it shows that, the Apostle Paul is explaining, like, yo, I can have all these different talents, I could have all these gifts. He had, a certain level of like diligence. You know what I'm saying? He had all these different things, understanding of all these different mysteries and so on and so forth, right? So a heavy portion was bestowed upon him, and he's saying like, okay, if I have all that and I don't have charity, I'm nothing, right? And we're living in a time where it's like, as I think about it, a lot of those fruits of the spirit, are really, really gonna be like strongly exemplified as things become even more expensive, as things become more difficult. You know what I'm saying? So we're just living in a time where essentially the end of all things is at hand, right? So, and as a matter of fact, I just want to let me just get this real quick, and I'll come back to that as an example. Just bear with me, hold on. I'll just read this here in Acts chapter 4. Let me see where I can just start just to hit the point. This is verse 32, and it says, "And the multitude of them that," so it says here, it says sharing amongst the believers, right? So, this is the character I'm kind of like also, speaking of as well, right? And it says, "The multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Yahushua, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet." Right. So when they heard, they were shaken, to actually come back, and actually, perform repentance. They essentially they essentially were in that spirit of, okay, I want to help, I want to help the apostles, right? They're out there, they're preaching, right? I think they had gotten arrested at this time as well, right? So at this point, there was essentially, essentially a pricking in their hearts to actually, move with a certain type of urgency to exemplify certain characteristics. It's like charity, like I was referring to earlier, right? And although through our apostles and elders on down, we don't actually, we understand that, as the scriptures say, we buy the truth and we sell it not, right? We don't actually put financial burdens upon, certain believers, right? But at the same time, understand that, they still had, they still felt a pricking in their spirit to actually exemplify certain characteristics, right? Exemplify certain some fruits of the spirit, right? Because if you go back into like the ancient times, under the Levitical priesthood, it would the idea was fairly similar in terms of like the relationship between the Israelites and the priests that were performing like more priestly duties, right? So for example, they would actually, the Israelites that had substance, of the other tribes, referring to as a, Like, say if you had substance back then, what you would do, for example, you would bring your first fruits, to the priest, right? And as well as like even certain sacrifices, like peace offerings, for example, the priests and their family were able to eat of that, particular sacrifice, right? So here it is, they're performing and giving, a portion of their goods to be able to actually help, the apostles in this time, right? So it's the same, same idea, right? We're can't we don't as Paul described it, reaping unto you, we've given you unto you spiritual things. Is it right for us to, essentially reap your carnal things, right? We don't actually beg, and have chat, and all this, donation, give your donation here. But if somebody wants to give that, they're by all means they're able to do so, right? So that's kind of what I'm kind of referring to, right? But going back to the point about, charity and essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? Character. Really, that's really the aspect as well. I'm just using charity as an example, right? So, this is verse 4 in First Corinthians 13, and it says, "Charity suffereth long and is kind, and charity envieth not, and vaunteth not itself, and is not puffed up." And that's one of the things that can happen, when you're essentially, in the making of many books, right? With all this like information, it can always lead to, being puffed up, right? So that's why, like I mentioned in a previous talking point about, that's why sometimes I find the Lord, it will give you a thorn to kind of keep you essentially humble, right? So, that's pretty much, that point I just wanted to discuss here, because, we're going to be in situations sometimes, or you might even be in situations right now where you have to exemplify certain fruits of the Spirit, right? Some, brothers might go through a little bit, more of a difficult situation, and, you might have to help them out in some kind of way. And, those kinds of character, and that's not something you get from these other books. That's really the point I'm kind of trying to hit here, right? You get that from actually going through these different accounts here, and what did certain people do. Like, for example, one of David's wives, Abigail, she actually helped out David and his men when they were in a time of need, right? They were actually in a situation where they needed a lot of that substance, right? And she made haste, and she gave them all this, substance. And as a matter of fact, let me just read it just for edification. I forgot exactly everything she did. What was that? So 1 Samuel 25:18, and it says, "Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and bottles of wine, and 5 sheep ready dressed, and 5 measures of parched corn, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. And she said to her servants, Go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal," right? So they were just in a situation, where, they needed some substance, David and his men, right? And, the husband at that time, Nabal, he refused them, So essentially she intercedes, and she essentially makes an intercession for her and her husband, right? Her being spared, but the Lord took out, the husband, right? But I'm just using this as an example. I'm not just using charity as an example, and there's other ways of other aspects of character and other fruits of the Spirit, to exemplify as well. But, I just thought I would just touch on this real quick. But, I sincerely pray, this was edifying. It doesn't always translate into, good character, and, all these other books. And I'm not knocking, this is not to knock, so knowing certain aspects of, certain, periods of history, right? At a period of time, I really enjoyed, just speaking on myself, I actually like learning about the Dark Ages, because that's a part of history, a lot of our people don't know, right? But the character portion is really also important for proper, development, right? Kind of like what Tobit was saying, the kind of counsel Tobit was given to his son, right? Those kinds of aspects, or or even times when Yahweh actually would perform a healing, and he would say, okay, don't tell anybody, right? That type of thing, right? That's kind of what I'm referring to here. Those aspects, those tenets, you can take out and extract, right? And apply to ourselves as well. But anyways, I've rambled on quite a bit, but I sincerely, hopefully this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.